Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Midwest Beaver Speaker Series webinar, Navigating the Pond Leveler Permitting Process in Wisconsin, which will be featuring Clay Frazer of Native Range Ecological. This event is being presented by the Illinois Beaver Alliance and the Superior Bioconservancy. My name is Rachel Schick-Siegel. I'm the president of the Illinois Beaver Alliance, and with me is Hannah Malachy, who is a consultant to the Superior Bioconservancy and an advisor to the Illinois Beaver Alliance, and Clay Frazer, our presenter. A couple of goals of this webinar that I want to discuss with you is that we're hoping that at the end, you will have a better understanding about how pond levelers are installed and how they function, a better understanding of the regulatory hurdles that need to be cleared in order to install pond levelers and culvert fencing, and also how our presenter, Clay Frazer, worked patiently with the Wisconsin DNR and his client to secure the required permit. A couple of housekeeping notes. If we are not able to answer all of the questions that appear in the Q&A or the chat during this session, we'll be sending a follow-up email to answer any additional questions, and we'll also send you a link to the recorded session. We're asking you to fill out the post-webinar survey. Please sign up for communications from our new Midwest Beaver Working Group, including announcements about other webinars and a quarterly newsletter that we're planning to launch next month. Please utilize the chat function to introduce yourselves. And if you could put questions for Clay in the Q&A, that'll help us keep track of them. Now about our speaker. Following a 25-year career working in wildlife management and ecological restoration for agencies, nonprofit conservation organizations, and private sector consulting firms, Clay and his business partner, Dan, started Native Range Ecological in the fall of 2022. Clay's journey of beaver rediscovery began with an invitation to attend BeaverCon in Baltimore in the summer of 2022. Soon after, he decided to pursue Beaver Corps certification training and to incorporate beaver management into his business's suite of services. Clay is particularly interested in the role that beavers can serve on the landscape to increase wetland functionality and support biodiversity as a keystone species. Clay lives with his wife of 21 years and his two sons at their home in Deerfield, Wisconsin. And now, without further ado, here is Clay Frazer and his presentation.
All right, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and get going here. Okay, I'm assuming we're good. Okay, so as Rachel had mentioned, we're going to be talking a little bit about pond levelers today, among a few other flow devices. But first, the definition of terms. Well, what is a flow device? And quite simply, what we mean by a flow device as it relates to our work with beaver coexistence is that it's simply a structure that goes into the water to control beaver damming to prevent flooding issues. And we know that road culverts and man-made drainage structures can very often be protected from beaver damming with a flow device. Flow devices are typically made with fencing, pipes, or both. And when they're properly built and installed, flow devices protect human properties and infrastructure from beaver dam flooding. And this is generally a very long-term, cost-effective solution. They also protect human interests and allow beavers to remain in place to create and maintain valuable wetlands. And of course, that last bullet point is really critical to our work as ecologists and as biologists.
Hey, Clay, really quick,
Yes.
do you mind moving it to presenter mode under the display settings, please?
Absolutely. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much. No, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, how's that? Is that better?
Display settings.
Yep, I'm on presenter mode.
You are.
I am.
Funny how that was working earlier.
Yeah, of course.
Let's
try it again.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, help me out, Hannah. What am I
Go
doing?
to slideshow. Play from beginning.
And there. Is that
Yeah,
good?
that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so when we're talking about flow devices for beaver coexistence, there's really three primary categories that we're concerned with. The first is flow devices to protect culverts and drains. And within that, there are really three subcategories of which you can see some examples of the photos on this slide. So culvert protection fences on the lower left-hand corner, that's actually a beaver deceiver that was originally developed by Skip Lyle on the East Coast, and that's been in use for many, many years, at least since the mid-1980s. The fence and pipe device that you see on the upper portion of the slide is a variation really of the culvert protection fence that's on the lower end. And then of course we have starter dams and diversion fences on the lower right-hand corner. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of each of these with the interest of time. We also think about beaver dam analogs, which have been really in the media recently. This is almost an entirely different presentation, and of course, I'm not going to dig deeply into that as well, but we are working in Wisconsin right now, consequently, to develop and permit some beaver dam analog projects as well. And we're certainly not the only ones working on BDAs in Wisconsin right now. So finally, the pond levelers. This is really going to be the focus of the talk today. And the first part of my talk is really going to be focused on the regulatory environment in terms of getting the proper permits and authorizations that we need from the agencies to make these happen. This is a photo of a modern pond leveler. This is a single intake PVC pipe pond leveler. And this is very similar to what we installed on the project we're going to highlight. Okay, so from a regulatory environment standpoint, we know that in Wisconsin, anytime that we're going to be putting something in water, one of the very first things to consider is navigability. And this is a Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, WDNR determination. Generally speaking, the bar is quite low on navigability, but if a stream is navigable, we move into that regulatory side of things, meaning that permits are likely going to be involved in a little bit higher level of planning. So the navigability just simply mainly means, again, the DNR is concerned in Wisconsin about keeping streams and rivers and waterways and wetlands open for public access as much as possible. And as you can imagine, navigability most often just means, can you put a boat in that water at any given point in the year? So one of our big challenges with flow devices in the upper Midwest, and certainly in Wisconsin specifically, is that we do not have a permit currently. We don't have a structural framework to put flow devices into. And so what that means is that we are essentially using the existing permit framework for putting miscellaneous structures, as it were, into water. And that is generally what we're going to be told when we contact the DNR and talk to them about these projects. We're going to be told that we're dealing with up to possibly 3 separate permits. We're dealing with U.S. Army Corps, which is actually very, very simple and straightforward. But we may also be dealing with Chapter 31 dam permitting, which oftentimes will require engineering and modeling, such as hydraulic and hydrologic, or what's called H&H studies. This is expensive and oftentimes is going to be prohibitive for most private landowners and sometimes even land management organizations. So the general knee-jerk reaction that we're getting from DNR is really coming from a place where they're not familiar with devices. They haven't maybe individually seen them. They generally have not permitted these individually as regulators. And so this is actually a quote that we got from an email, and I'll let you read it if you can see the screen. Essentially, it's basically saying that most people who consider these things end up not doing them or not pursuing them because of the challenges in the regulatory world, right? So it's a little bit of chicken versus the egg happening right now. Our mission, our initial goal in working with DNR staff is always to make them feel comfortable with what we're looking to do, make them understand our motivation behind this, and that we're trying to enhance the resource and not degrade it. We're not doing this with ill intent is the upshot, right? So we're trying to develop that trust and rapport with individual DNR people. And you know, the irony is every time we move around in the state, there's various regions and various people that are responsible for permitting these projects. So it takes time. It takes numerous meetings and phone calls and citing examples and showing them what we're looking to do. But ultimately, in this project, we did obtain our permit. It took 8 months to get it, but we got it. And we're going to walk you through a little bit about how we did that. And then essentially the second half of the talk is going to be focused on the project itself and how we installed it. So simply stated, there are two classifications of wetland permits in Wisconsin. You either get a general permit or an individual permit. And an individual permit simply means more scrutiny. It's a more expensive process. The application fees are a little higher. All those bullet points, I'm not going to read them off. You can see those. They all apply to an IP or an individual permit in Wisconsin right now, which of course, we don't have a general permit for flow devices, and we may be a ways away from that. That's something that we're certainly interested in pursuing and helping happen on the regulatory side from a statute standpoint. But right now, individual permitting means we need very specific plans and specifications. We may need threatened and endangered species review and historic and cultural review. And there's a public comment period that goes out to the neighbors or other stakeholders that may be affected by the project. They have usually 30 days to comment on that. So we went through all of this year with this project that we're going to talk about. And we finally did get an individual permit for a miscellaneous structure granted to us in September of this year. So why do we obtain these permits in the first place? I get asked this question a lot. I get primarily asked it from landowners that we're working with or land agencies because they know they're going to have to go through this process and it's going to be time consuming, and potentially costly. So the answer that I come up with in doing this is that, number one, as consultants, where I'm standing on my side of the table, we're working with DNR on numerous different types of projects all the time. As professionals, we don't have the ability or the luxury of skirting the regulatory permit process. So this is something that we have to go through just to be legitimate and legal in our projects. But possibly more importantly is we really want DNR staff to become comfortable and familiar with flow devices in general. We want them to understand how they work so that the next time this happens, the next time that we're putting a permit through, we have precedents, right? We can cite an example. We can even go back to these individuals, hopefully within the DNR, and say, hey, this person granted us this permit. Here was the process that we worked through. And so it's really, really important globally to be legitimate in what we're doing, to offer validity and credential, and to make sure that the next few times that we do this, it makes it a little faster and easier, hopefully, for those next people. So where does the landowner in Wisconsin right now go for guidance on beaver management? Well, the DNR a few years ago put out a beaver control guidelines document. This is a photo of the cover page. And it really talks a lot about the regulatory aspects of trapping beaver and managing beaver on your landscape. It does tend to be a little bit heavy on damage mitigation and trapping. But of course, those have been things that have been integral to Wisconsin's beaver population and beaver management for a very long time. Some of the options that are outlined include learning to, or these are actually chapters or section titles. Learning to live with a beaver is one, thank goodness. And so there is some credence offered to this idea of coexistence, although that term is not really used. There's 5 pages of frequently asked questions regarding laws applicable to removal, relocation, and lethal management, but very little about flow devices or really the idea of coexistence. There is some reference to them, although most of them are pretty antiquated. Most of the references that talk about flow devices or beaver coexistence go back 40 plus years, except for one citation, ironically, I found that was from the Wildlife Society Bulletin in 2013. And you probably can't see it. This is not a great snapshot of it, but it's essentially an article that came out in 13 in the Wildlife Society Bulletin by Taylor and Singleton. This is that article. If you wanted to look it up, you can find it, and you can get a hold of this through me. I think my email will be up in the chat. But the evolution of flow devices used to reduce flooding by beavers, a review. So this came out in 13, and ironically, Mike Callahan had two articles from 2013 and 2005, respectively, cited in that article, and he was talking about the improvements to modern flow devices and the improvements that he had made over the years on some of these things. So pond levelers, how did we get to where we are with them? Where did they start? Really back in the 1970s, people started experimenting with pond levelers, but around the mid to late 1980s, researchers at Clemson University came up with this Clemson pond leveler. And this was pretty successful, a pretty good design. It was in use up until probably the late 90s or early 2000s. There were some challenges with it, which I'll talk about in a moment here, but the flexible pond leveler was really the next evolution in this and was developed and perfected by Mike Callahan, who later formed the Beaver Institute and the Beaver Corps, which we'll discuss in a moment. So this is what that Clemson pond leveler looked like. Basically an 8-inch perforated PVC tube with a cage. And the intent here was to regulate flow, keep the water levels to a nominal level or a preferred level, which is one major goal of a pond leveler, while at the same time kind of tricking the beaver into not understanding how or why this is happening. And so the goal here is, you can see that there's caging around the intakes of the pipe, and we're trying to make sure that beaver don't clog that, right? This thing has some limitations, and of course, one of them was that the pipe was a little bit undersized, and they were a little bit expensive and tough to build sometimes. So the flexible pond leveler, the next evolution here, was an improvement. And you can see it has a domed intake fence where the plastic PVC pipe runs through it. This whole thing flows through. And if you can see my cursor, where this pipe comes out at the end is really the critical element to the controlling the water levels or the pond levels. Wherever we put the elevation of that pipe essentially is where the pond level will equalize to. We submerge the pipe and the intake fence to prevent beavers from detecting that flow. If they can't detect the flow of water moving through it, they will not try to clog it up, right? So our goal is to drop the water, this is critical, only to the height that protects human interests and allows the beaver to stay in the system. And that's generally 2 to 3 feet of water is what they require. Pond levelers do require annual inspection and maintenance. And I can tell you, that is one of the elements in the past of challenges we've had is if any of the wildlife or fisheries folks have used these in our state, they may have put in a Clemson pond leveler, and they rarely came back to monitor it or do any maintenance. And when it failed to perform or it got clogged up after a few years, oftentimes they just simply said these things don't work, and they claim them to be failures. So we know that we need some maintenance on these things annually, at least, to make sure they're still functioning. So again, this is just a few shots, or a couple of photos rather, of what the both ends of the single intake pond leveler look like. The cage dome on the one end that's going to be submerged, and then the business end that is set through the dam on the opposite side. Okay, so to tell the story of how we got this project in the water, we had a contact from a landowner in early 2023. And once we started to communicate with her, we got a contract with her to do a site assessment, which also involved interviewing the neighboring landowners and making sure we understood what their concerns were. That's a critical element to that. We submitted an assessment report in which we outlined the recommendation of a flexible pond leveler. At that point, the landowner agreed to continue pursuing this, and we started communications with DNR, essentially what we call pre-permitting meetings, and we had several of those. So I wanted to play a quick video. I know this may not replicate great. It may be a little jerky. This is a Google Earth video that indicates the general location of our project. You can see we're about an hour north of Madison, Wisconsin, just outside Rio, Wisconsin, which is Columbia County. I'm going to pause this just for a moment if I can, but you can see a pretty substantial wetland complex here to the southeast that flows essentially into a waterfowl production area that is on the south end of the client's land. And if you notice, there's a pretty substantial hemi-marsh, we call it. It's a combination of open water and cattails or other emergent vegetation. The Beaver Lodge is a very substantial structure that's a few hundred yards west of this large historic dam complex. So this was here. There were beaver dams here for quite a while before this landowner even bought this land, okay? And we chose the selection, the location of our leveler based on the main outfall, this creek here that runs through a berm and into the neighbor's land. Okay, there's just another photo indicating the property boundary, this 40-acre parcel, the Beaver Lodge, and the Beaver Dam that we worked on. And there is another Google Earth image. Just really interesting to see how large of a wetland complex this really is. It's several hundred acres, okay? That's a photo of the lodge, pretty substantial structure. I threw this in kind of for the plant geeks out there, the fellow botanists of the world, who might have some appreciation for this plant. This is Carex stricta, tussock sedge. It's another keystone species in the sense that it's a native wetland sedge that is very much dependent upon beaver wetland hydrology. It's associated very closely with beaver, and it supports a lot of other native wetland plant communities in and of itself. So this is a metal culvert that was placed years ago on the landowner's property, and it goes through a berm that we actually believe was a part of a historic beaver dam. Moving outside of that, you can see the flow that moves through this dam itself. Okay. Now, I put this slide up. I'm not going to run through it. I know you can't probably read it, but you can see how onerous this is. This is essentially the conditions of the permit that we were given by the DNR. This is typical stuff. When you're issued a wetland permit, there's a whole lot of strings attached of things that you have to do even after you install your project, right? Most of it has to do with monitoring, posting the permit. But I would bring your attention to the final condition here, which was essentially, and I'll pull it out. It's essentially that we were needed to conduct elevational surveys of the pipe, the impoundment surface elevations, maps showing the anticipated flowage extents, and establishing an elevational benchmark tying the local datum, right? So essentially, it's kind of a little bit like they're looking at this like a construction project, right? And I'm going to circle back to that in a moment, but that was a little bit problematic. We had to navigate through that and figure out a way to collect that elevational data, okay? Just a few photos of us going to collect the materials we use. You can see on the top of my truck, I've got these agricultural panels here. This essentially is 6-gauge galvanized 4x4 mesh, what's called agricultural panels. You can get these at Tractor Supply Company in our area. Relatively inexpensive materials, 15-inch single wall corrugated PVC that we just picked up from Menards, okay? Here's our site. You can see me standing in the water. It's about waist deep, which on me is about 3 feet, give or take. And we had a pretty nice flat surface there with a little bit of silt load, but not a whole lot. That was a perfect location for us to put our intake dome. Okay, so October 24th was our installation day. We hauled in our boats and all the materials we needed to get there. That's my partner, Dan, securing the pipe inside the intake dome with wire caging or wire cabling. And of course, this site presented an interesting challenge in the sense that we couldn't drive a truck. Oftentimes you can drive equipment right to the site you're working on, which would be a huge benefit. Here we had to boat our material in a John boat with an electric trolling motor, made a few trips, finally got everything unloaded, and we got everything kind of preliminarily set up and ready to go. So you see these green PVC floats that go underneath the intake. The intention there was we put that the leveler or the intake rather on the floats and push those out into the water. You can notice also in this photo that the top of the pipe has a line cut through it with a circular saw. That is to prevent air from building up inside the pipe and floating the pipe up. We want the pipe to actually fill with water and settle to the bottom, which of course we also do that with the assistance of cinder blocks, which we're tying to these pipes, okay? In the foreground of this photo, you can also see the coupler that we put on there that couples the two separate 20-foot sections of PVC pipe together. We zip tie those, and then we additionally screw in galvanized screws to make sure that the thing doesn't slide around and they stay together well. Okay, we're getting close to pushing this thing in. All right. And there it is. We got it in the water. It's settled right about where we want. So we're happy. And we're going to be making some final adjustments in a minute here. But we finally get the pipe through the dam where we want. And we grab additional logs, mud, vegetation, whatever we can find to secure the top of that pipe and get it set to where it's going to be secure. You notice the pipe starts to flow water right away, which is great. And that's just another shot of immediately after the installation. You can see how much water is coming through. That is a drone image that Dan took. This is just a snapshot of the video, but you can see that was taken a couple of weeks ago after we had some ice. A little grainy, but you can probably see the dome, the intake dome, the pipe coming through. And if you look closely, you'll see that metal CMP culvert, which the pipe is outfalling into to go to the neighbor's land. Okay, a series here of photos that really indicate how this thing is functioning and what it's doing by design to bring the surface water levels down on the pond. You see what it looked like the day that we installed it, October 24th. And a few weeks later, November 7th, you can see a reduced flow rate coming through that pipe. And then again, roughly a little over a month after the installation, you can see about where we are right now with a much reduced flow rate. This is equalized. And you'll also notice that we've brought the elevation of the pond down 8 to 10 inches, give or take, on that. You can tell by the distance of the water how high it is on the dome, the intake dome, right? So everything is working great so far. The beaver are leaving it alone. There's just another photo, probably a better photo, indicating the distance the water elevation has dropped, about 8 or 9 inches so far. Now, we know that we may have to go back in and put a protection fence around that pipe. We haven't done that yet because the beaver have been leaving it alone so far. It's likely that next year we will have to go back in and put something similar to this to prevent the beaver from clogging that pipe up if they try doing that. We have a camera on that pipe now, and we know that that hasn't happened. So another great question we get often asked is, what does this cost? So in full transparency, this is pretty close to what it cost. The assessment was about $1,000. The building materials were about $850. The labor for construction installation, a few $1,000. DNR permit application, $800. And the time it took us to get that permit was right around $5,000. Now, that right now is the prohibitive part. We are hoping to be able to slowly whittle that permit facilitation cost down to maybe even less than $1,000, hopefully, of consulting time to get that permit, right? And I will also say that through grant assistance that came through from Beaver Institute, the costs significantly were defrayed for our client landowner. She did not actually end up paying that full amount. So I talked about the Beaver Institute, and just to give them a plug, if you're not familiar with them, they are the only national nonprofit beaver organization. Their mission is advocacy, education, and research, okay? And their vision is to restore ecological balance with beavers. That is their website. I encourage you to check it out. There's some great stuff on it, okay? Lots of really good links. And another thing that's part of Beaver Institute is Beaver Core. That is what I'm a part of. That's a professional training and certification program for flow devices and beaver coexistence services, okay? It really kind of is set up for private sector small business models, but now we have all kinds of people from all walks of life that are going through Beaver Core certification to learn how to install flow devices and maintain them. So you go through online lessons and exams in Beaver Core, and you learn how to plan, permit, and install at least 4 flow devices to complete your full certification. If you go onto the Beaver Core website, you can click in your location, either as a word search of the nearest town or your zip code, and it will pull up, as I've noticed here, or you notice here, my name if I enter in my zip code. Okay. So just to close out, this photo was off of a trail cam that we have on our leveler that was taken on December 2nd. And if you look closely, we have a couple of bobcats, probably a breeding pair, that have come to inspect and check out our work on the beaver dam. And I just throw this in because this is an interesting photo kind of depicting that we've got such a myriad of wildlife that beaver dams and beaver wetlands in general support. And so this is integral to part of why we do this work, is supporting that level of biodiversity. So that is all I have for the main talk. And at that point, I guess I can take some questions then.
Thank you so much, Clay. That was such a wonderful presentation. My favorite were the 2 pictures. One, the one of the timeline, so the differences of seeing the water level flow, and the bobcats, of course, you know, the biodiversity, and it's just very cool to see that. Yeah, so we'll just jump into some questions. We've had a few that have been submitted already. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to utilize the Q&A chat, and we'll get to those as well. So to start,
Anna, should I stop my share? Should I stop my share now?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
Make it a little bit more face-to-face.
Sure.
So there's a few questions that we have off the bat. So someone had mentioned talking to the need of having multiple levelers on a site. They talked about an experience that they had where they installed a Clemson device in the late 1990s. It worked great for 2 years, and then the beaver abandoned the dam site and moved upstream. Pipe fell into creek and had like no legal means to boost it. So I'm assuming they had to install another one. Could you just speak to the need for multiple levelers on a site a little bit?
Sure. So we get trained to utilize multiple levelers generally in 2 situations or possibly 3. Primarily, they would be stream systems that are narrow, that would be too narrow for a single intake leveler to work, right? Because if you have consistent flow that's directed just in one location, particularly say you have a 12 to 20 foot wide stream course, that would be a more ideal situation for a dual intake leveler system. Okay. Now, I know in the past on Clemson systems, they've which don't really use an intake dome, they just have caging around the pipe itself. You can place multiple of those. You can place 2 or 3 of those to work in series. But again, I know that if they're closer together, I've heard that they're easier for a beaver to clog them or plug them up, right? The other issue with Clemson levelers is that they really don't work great in the winter because they ice up. The great part of the intake system with the single pipe leveler is that it's below the ice all winter, and it's going to flow water consistently all winter long. So in northern Wisconsin, or almost anywhere really in the upper Midwest, with our winters, the Clemson levelers are really not as ideal for that one reason. But the other reason people will use multiple intake systems is if you just have generally low water. If you have less than 2 feet of water, or there's times of the year where base flow reduces to less than 2 feet of elevation, that is where a multiple intake leveler would be more advantageous.
Great. Thank you so much. We have another question that's switching topic a little bit, but someone, as we have a current conversation about the conversation between trout and beaver. So someone was curious if you could address, how do you assess whether a flow device is appropriate on a trout stream? There's conversations about the science behind whether or not beaver dams degrade trout habitat or if they support them. I know that's still something that the WDNR has been working through. But could you just talk a little bit about how you assess if a flow device is appropriate on a trout stream?
Sure. Well, number one, it's a completely different level of consideration in design and permitting if we're dealing with a trout stream or even a tributary to a trout stream, which is actually the case on the BDA project that we're working on right now. It's going to involve a little bit more research and site analysis regarding what types of aquatic species exist there, at what times of the year are they utilizing that system biologically. So DNR fisheries staff have been really great. They're really willing to come out and take a look at things and make an assessment and really help offer some science. The beaver and trout, debate is ongoing. This is not a new idea. We hear about this all the time. On face value, a lot of people will say, well, beaver and trout coexisted in most of the country. In Western states, salmonids coexist even today very well with beaver. They learn to jump dams. Beaver dams naturally are not they're not pervious. They are pervious systems, I should say, which means that they have places where fish find their way through, either through or under or over. Sometimes in different times of the year, if the water levels are high enough, they have an easier time getting up and over that dam. But there has been some controversy again in Wisconsin. We had a study done, quite a while ago that indicated that in low gradient systems, that simply means slower moving streams moving through less topography, which is sometimes the case in northern Wisconsin, for example. Beaver dams can impede trout movements, and they can certainly also just reduce opportunities for fishermen and anglers in general to pursue fish. However, there's also, on the other end of that controversy, there's data that supports the fact that beaver dams actually increase the size of trout because they create refugia. They can actually create better trout conditions where trout and other salmonids actually survive better. Their enhancements to that wetland standpoint from a fishery and a fish rearing standpoint is well documented. But again, part of the question I think had to do with considerations and design for flow devices as well. So we do think about that. The reality is that it's been well documented that fish will move through these cage intake domes with a 4x4 inch panel. It would take a pretty large fish to not be able to enter that pipe and move through it. So that's been documented very well. In the sense of culvert protection fences or other flow devices, there are some great designs that Beaver Corps are trained to install that allow fish and other wildlife, even small mammals, to move freely through those fences and around them to get into the culvert potentially if they want to do that, but yet prevent the beaver from clogging up those culverts, right? So there's definitely considerations there. Again, paramount to what we're doing as resource managers is thinking holistically about the system. We're certainly not trying to, support beaver at the cost of fish, right? And so it's something that we're sensitive to in design, but every site is unique and every site warrants its own investigation and consideration and design.
Great, thank you. There were two questions related to the costs. I'm going to group them together just in general because they have the same topic. But one was asking if you could reshare the cost breakdown. And another one was asking about how much it would cost to install one pond leveler.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let me see, let me know if you're seeing it.
Yeah, it looks great from our end.
Okay. Did I glaze over the cost slide? There we go. Okay.
There it is. Yeah.
All right. So again, keep in mind that, in other places in the world, I know for a fact, particularly in the East Coast and West Coast, when people put these things in, they don't cost this much, right? At least you can see visually that half the cost of making this happen in terms of if you hire a consultant or a professional to facilitate this for you is just simply dealing with the regulatory hurdles, right? We as consultants, we get paid for our time, right? And so at least half that cost that you're seeing in front of you was wrapped up in the time it took to get the permits, right? And then you've got almost another $1,000 individual permit application fee that's being processed right now. We're hoping to move the needle towards the general permit, which is a fraction of that cost and much, much faster to expedite. Okay. The labor and the building materials, in our part of the world, it's going to be probably right around that $3,500 to $4,000 watermark for that if you were to hire someone to do that. But again, keep in mind that in this situation, if you remember, one of the big challenges was site access, which creates more time and more complication logistically to get the materials out to the site. I know that in places where they can drive trucks to within a few hundred feet or shorter to where they're working on a dam, these costs go down to like $2,000 from a materials and labor standpoint, right? That wouldn't include the assessment or necessarily the permit acquisition. But I know that $2,000 to $3,000 is kind of a range for kind of cost of labor and materials, right? Was there something specific to costs of maintenance as well that I saw, Hannah, as a question?
Yeah, there's a
Sure.
few more questions about costs that we can go into. One of the questions that we were just curious about was, would this be an accurate representation for one pond leveler? Or, because I know that this is a cost breakdown for the one pond leveler that you installed. And I know you've just touched on how they can be cheaper elsewhere or like less expensive elsewhere. Could you just like touch on what could it be expected for like one pond leveler across different ranges?
Different ranges like within the US or
Yeah, like
cost
what
ranges?
yeah, like what
Right.
could we expect for like a pond leveler in different regions?
Sure. Well, I mean, different parts of the country, like the East Coast, like I said, they're doing this for under $5,000, all in, all done, from start to finish, right? And I know some places are even less than that. There's places in rural Iowa, there's places in western states, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, where they're putting these things in for $1,500 to $2,000 a piece, right? But again, different economy. Building materials may be less expensive, who knows? But at the end of the day, yeah, that range is probably going to be somewhere between $2,000 and $5,000 if I had to range it out, right? Our goal is in a couple more years, we like the cost of these, maybe even within another 1 to 2 years to come down by 50%, right? To say we should be able to do this easily for $5,000, start to finish, right? And the more of these we put in, to my point earlier, the less expensive it's going to get for everybody because it's going to make it easier to get them permitted. That's like, as you can see, that's half the cost of making it happen.
Thank you. Yeah, and then there's some follow-ups to, let's stay on this page because there's been some follow-ups to that. One of the questions was with regard to the cost, it can be discouraging, which you had just touched on how it's, a pretty high cost right now with the fact that this is a newer process and we're still working on getting a bunch of these installed for private landowners. There's a few questions in terms of, can a Wisconsin township use road aid to purchase materials and help with the cost of a leveler? Can wildlife services pay for a township leveler rather than trapping them out? What about those kind of different processes for getting aid?
Yeah, so I'm not as familiar with road aid. I'm not exactly sure what that is. That's the first time hearing of it. I will tell you that, USDA through wildlife services does go out in the world and assist landowners and agencies and municipalities with beaver management. They have installed flow devices, although there's some question about how many and and what types, what designs are they using. I really don't know. We want to learn more about that right now. Ultimately, we recognize that one of the big challenges of some of these places are that they're very inaccessible. They're tough to get to, and it's certainly not, it may be cost prohibitive to try to even get materials into some of these very remote locations. But in general, roadways, townships, organizations like municipalities that are responsible for managing roads, there is assistance available through the state. There are programs that will offer, assistance, if not full outright completion of flow devices. because it's public interest, right? I mean, we don't want roads and bridges washing out. We had to have our infrastructure protected. And the reality is, as you know, as I'm noticing in chat that someone aptly stated, removing beaver is not sustainable. It has to be done every single year. The trapping is not super expensive, but the challenge is there's fewer people doing it. There are more beaver in the northern tier of our state than there used to be, at least in recent years. And it has to be done year after year. It's just not sustainable. And so if you added up what it cost over and, amortized over 5 to 6 or 8 years to trap out beaver in good beaver country, good beaver habitat, as compared in the differential to what it costs to install and maintain flow devices like a culvert fence, the culvert protection fence wins out. So it's definitely a payout period, a lot like, sustainable energy would be. But once you hit that payout period, these flow devices are good for, on average, 10 years in the water. And the only annual maintenance is generally just inspection. Sometimes I've heard people tell me it takes as little as 30 minutes a year to maybe go out, make sure they're set correctly, reset the elevations, reset posts on them, clear out some debris that may have found its way in. It's very minimal annual maintenance and inspection.
Yeah, that's great. And that kind of ties into a different question someone had about the annual maintenance challenge. Is there a good way to educate what goes into that, both in time and cost? You touched on how municipalities often see trapping beaver as a one and done kind of situation, but it's actually more long-term than that. So how do we get the word out there that these non-lethal devices can actually help a lot more in the long run?
Well, it starts right now, right today, right, with having webinars and inviting people to attend and take an hour out of their lives. It's not easy. The answer is one person at a time. That's really what it comes down to. It's not even one agency at a time or one municipality at a time. It's generally one key person inside those organizations who wants to see something change and wants to move the needle towards ecology and away from non-sustainable lethal management. So, that's the bottom line. There is no silver bullet answer there. This is the work of many organizations, including Illinois Beaver Alliance and, Beaver Institute and so many other organizations in our country that are doing this work. It's really one conference, one webinar, and sometimes one individual human being at a time.
Yeah, no, totally. I would agree with that. There's a few questions moving on to more the specific permitting process. One has asked if that APHIS says they do non-lethal beaver management and had a question on whether or not their permitting process is easier. I don't know if you know much about that, but if you do, I would love to hear more about perhaps what might be different between between private landowners versus governmental agencies.
Yeah, well, that goes to the heart of how I've made my living for nearly the last 15 years in the private sector. I can tell you that if you apply for permits as a consultant, as a for-profit business, you are generally held to a higher standard and you're scrutinized a little bit differently than if you are a regulator or a municipality. Say you were a nonprofit landowner who owned land and wanted to install a flow device. It's just generally a little bit less scrutiny for whatever reason, right? I think they hold us to a higher standard, and that's okay. That said, though, I will tell you that in the past year, I have spoken to a number of agency people, which I certainly won't name names, but I'm talking about people in wildlife, in fisheries, even people in USDA APHIS who have installed permits or have installed flow devices without permitting at all, without even trying to obtain permitting, right? And so I say to them, well, number one, congratulations. I hope your device is still working. But at the end of the day, did it move the needle to help change the view of public opinion on flow devices, right? Because that's really what it takes. And it's part of the reason we're going through this process. We're so fortunate to be able to find some of these individuals as landowners who want to pursue this, to learn to coexist with beaver, right? And are able and willing to pay what it takes. Those first few people are pioneers right now in our state. The first ones to help put these through and get these flow devices installed completely legally, completely legitimately with full permitting, right? And I'm not trying to make it harder for, I have a lot of counterparts that work in DNR and in, Fish and Wildlife Service or USDA who are trying to work on these. If they can get these things done without permits, more power to them. I don't begrudge them for that. But again, if someone finds out what they did and they look at what I had to go through, yeah, eyebrows are going to get raised somewhere. And usually that's going to be inside the agencies themselves, I'm afraid. So I encourage people to, as painful as this process is right now, to go through it in hopes that every single time we do it, it will subsequently become easier and these things will become more accepted.
Great, thank you. There's another question that kind of touches on that. Are there any efforts underway to streamline the permitting process in the DNR? Are they trying to create separate categories beyond a general permit, or do they need to see more success stories in order to be more accepting of these permits?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think right now there is a need for this. I think that the regulators that I'm interfacing with, that me and my business partner are working with every day, they identify, number one, there is a need to do this, to make this more streamlined. They're not just concerned about my time, they're concerned about their time. These are people that are already stretched to the limits with what they're being asked to do. And this process takes up a lot more of their time than it really needs to, simply because, again, we don't have a box to check in Wisconsin right now for flow device permitting. So I think that the need will come from within. From without, we can make the case, we can continue to show the case studies that these are working. We want to make sure that we're designing them to work, number one, but ultimately the people that we're working with that are regulators in wetlands and waterways and fisheries, in wildlife, and now even within dam safety, these are mostly engineers that we're working with, and they identified that these things can work, but we need statutory change. We need regulation to change right now to give us a place to go that's just not so prohibitive and taxing. And I think we'll get there. I just think it's going to take some time. And what I can contribute, what we can contribute in our industry is one good flow device in at a time, making our case one at a time. That's what we're trying to do right now.
Yeah, that's great. We have two last questions that we'll touch on. The first one is, how is maintenance accounted for in the permit or responsibility of parties? Does the landowner inspect or consult, or does the WDNR? They're talking about like annual maintenance consideration or any of the upkeep that's necessary for these pond levelers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another great question. The reality is that, I flashed up on the screen for a moment all this onerous list of conditions that the DNR puts out when they give us a permit. Part of that states that the DNR has the right to come out and inspect this if they want to. Unfortunately, that rarely happens. We would welcome that. I'd love to give the DNR a tour of this. We've offered that. We realize it's difficult for them to do that, although that needs to happen. They need to physically see these things work to become more comfortable with them. But the landowner right now is not legally bound in the conditions of the permit to do inspections and maintenance on them, right? That probably should be in there, because again, if you don't do the inspections and the annual maintenance, they're more likely to fail, and it gives the DNR a place to go to say, aha, so you put this thing in, and a year later it got clogged up and it didn't work, right? So we're trying to avoid that. It's inherent to the landowner and us as consultants to do that maintenance. Hopefully we get paid to do it, but the reality is these first few that we put through, it just needs to get done. It doesn't matter if we do it, the DNR does it, or the landowner does it. Someone needs to go put eyes on it once a year to make sure it's working.
Yeah, it's a great point. We want to make sure that these are successful, not just a one and done kind of situation. And then the last question that we'll end on, and I think it's a very good question to walk away with. They talked about how you worked with a landowner who wanted to preserve beaver populations. How do you persuade landowners who aren't already inclined to want to cohabitate with beavers? Like what kind of arguments might change the minds of landowners who consider them pests and obstacles to land ownership / development?
Yeah. Oh, wow. I mean, that's a huge question, and again, I could talk another hour about that because I've made, a career out of trying to convince people oftentimes to do the right thing from an ecological and biological standpoint when it may not always be in their financial best interest to do so, right? I think that, it's important to appeal to people's nature to find out what makes them tick. If an individual owns a piece of land with a sole intent of producing profit from it, this is a really tough sell, right? Because the reality is that there's a lot of things you can do. They're less expensive. You can definitely, the DNR will allow you to trap these beaver out. You can shoot them. You can blow their dams up. You can blow up their lodges if you can legally do so. But it's much more difficult to actually coexist with them. But the benefits are so much greater, right? It takes time. I've talked to a lot of people who've done this for many more years than myself and my partner, and the story is always the same. It takes numerous meetings. You have to have that connection. You have to go out, sit at those kitchen tables, listen to them and their concerns, and realize that inherently people aren't trying to always do the bad thing. They're not. I think inherently people want to do the right thing for wildlife and for wetlands and water quality, right? But they have to be led to that. They have to come to that conclusion sometimes on their own. And we try to give them little nuggets bit by bit so they can come around to those ideas kind of on their own, in their own capacity, in their own time. And some people just don't. Some people won't. And that's okay. We will focus our efforts on those that we can reach, right? And hopefully that's a growing consensus right now.
Totally. Well, thank you so much, Clay. That kind of last piece that you said, hopefully these kind of webinars and the more work that you do will help kind of show people that these proof of concepts are something to be worth pursuing, and we can start moving that needle. So thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. I learned a lot and I've talked to you a lot about this already. So if anyone else has any unanswered questions, I know we hopefully got to every single one of them. But feel free to email the Midwest Beaver Summit at Gmail, or you can email Clay and he can follow up with you. And with that, we'll begin our wrap up and get you guys on your way so we close out that good hour. Rachel, do you mind sharing yeah, mine hasn't been working. Great. So yeah, this was our first webinar of our speaker series that we're hoping to continue on a quarterly basis. If you'd like to stay up to date on what kind of speakers we'll be bringing next, please feel free to sign up for our email list. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can sign up for the speaker series information. There's also a link to sign up for a Midwest Beaver working group, where we'll be working on issues across the Midwest and trying to improve beaver management here. And once again, this was presented to you by the Illinois Beaver Alliance and the Superior Bioconservancy, two organizations who are working to help support beaver coexistence across the Midwest and the nation. And finally, just to wrap up, we will send a follow-up email answering any unanswered questions and providing a recording of today's talk to all registrants. I do believe that we've answered all questions, but once again, if you didn't feel like you had time to ask one or you think of something later, feel free to email us and we'll give a follow-up. There's also a post-attendee survey we would love for you to fill out so that we can improve our future talks and perhaps bring topics that are of interest to you and the group. I had just talked about joining our Midwest Beaver Working Group newsletter or staying up to date about Speaker Series events. You can scan the QR code that's right here, a fancy schmancy new way of signing up, or Rachel will be putting in a chat link, which I believe she has already done, if you want to find that. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that Wisconsin, the Wildlife Services process has now just opened a public scoping period that closes on December 20th. So I don't know if you attended our Midwest Beaver Summit, but we had touched on the fact that there was a hopes for revising the environmental assessment for beaver management, and Wildlife Services has decided that they will be revising the environmental assessment, which is phenomenal. So right now they're giving an opportunity for people to comment on science that they would like to see included, data, studies, anything that they should take into consideration while revising the EA. And we have a link to it that we can put into there where you can provide comments. I'll put it in right now. And on top of that, we also have created a letter that people can sign if they would like to join on as an individual or as a organization to support some of the science that we have compiled as an organization to, promote science for beaver management across Wisconsin. And I just sent both of those in the chat, one if you'd like to comment on your own, and then another if you'd like to sign on to the letter that we've created. If you have any follow-up questions about that, please feel free to email me at malachyh@grinnell.edu, and I would be happy to give you any information. So yeah, with that, just thank you to everyone for joining us. This was a wonderful presentation. Thank you again to Clay, and we hope to see you at the next one.